Maistoihin tiemme kuntoi, missä luotien laulu vain soi. Emme tienneet kun läksimme silloin, kuka joskus palata voi. Ero tää juosu haudoissa on. Meidän käskyllä.
Stories about war are almost always men's stories, and what they describe is mainly the course of battle and the soldiers' sufferings and troubles. But Finnish women too have always been ready to fight for our homes. This has never been more true than during the Second World War, when there were regularly over 20,000 women working at the front. Nor has this woman's story about war come to an end. The Federation of Finnish Women Veterans continues to promote the goals of those who fought in the last wars in the pursuit of peace. The Federation is an organization including many of the women who served at the front during the Second World War, the Women's Lotta Svärd Corps of the Civil Guard, the doctors, nurses, nurse aides, the Green Sisters and conscripted workers, and women working in military administration. The earliest Red Cross-type activities in Finland can be dated back to 1877, when the Finnish Association for the Care of the Wounded and Sick was first set up. Following Finland's independence in 1917, the association was officially recognized, and in 1922, Field Marshal Mannerheim was elected as its president. In 1926, the Finnish Red Cross and the association collaborated to set up a joint register of nurses.
No, ne tehtiin kaikki Viipurin kurssilaiset, ne oli Viipurissa sairaanhoitokoulussa ja silloin kun sitten
So all of us on the course in Viipuri, I was at the nursing school in Viipuri, and so then before we finished, well, we made this agreement there with the Red Cross that if there's a crisis in Finland, then we'd come and help the Red Cross.
Tulemme auttamaan Punaisristin työssä.
So you'd have to report to the hospital manager. In wartime, you'd be sent to work in the military hospitals. But long before this, during the years of Russian oppression before Finnish independence in 1917, there were women involved in the Finnish resistance. During the First World War, Baroness Ruth Munk and Saara Rampanen, a nurse, were with the Finnish Jaeger Battalion who went to Germany for training, and were mainly stationed at Military Hospital 55, where most of the Finnish wounded and sick were treated. The roots of the Finnish Sotilaskoti, or Soldiers' Recreation Center, also date back to the Finns in Germany during the First World War. In 1918, during the Finnish Civil War, when the Germans landed in Hanko and entered Helsinki, the first center was set up in the Helsinki YMCA, where it continued to function into 1920. By the end of 1918, similar centers were being set up all around the country, and during the 20s and 30s there were 40 of them altogether. The first task was to raise donations. Local associations put on amateur theater productions, evening socials, and concerts. A national association was established in 1921, and it is still based in Helsinki today. Members of the organization gained valuable experience of operating under field conditions, and they still do so nowadays on Army field exercises.
Following Finland's independence, the emphasis in women's service with the military was placed on the voluntary and non-combatant principles. This position, which became the official policy of the Republic, was formulated by Field Marshal Mannerheim in 1918 during the Civil War in response to a query from a women's association in Lapua. He stated that women should carry out other non-combatant duties and that only men should have the duty and right to engage in armed combat. In the Tales of Lieutenant Stuhl by Johan Ludvig Runeberg, the national poet of Finland, one of the characters is Lotta Svärd, the wife of one of the soldiers who cooks for the soldiers. In 1919, Colonel von Essen, the first commander-in-chief of the Finnish Civil Guard organization, proclaimed, "The women of Finland too have their task in the Civil Guard. These can best be fulfilled through the formation of Lotta Svärd associations." By the end of that year, around 200 of these associations had been set up, and in the following year they joined together to form a national federation. Initially, this functioned under the Civil Guard. Later, it became an independent organization and grew to become the largest women's organization in Finland. From 1929 to 1944, the organization was led by Fani Luukkonen, who became the national figurehead and was known as the Lotta General. The country was divided into districts. During the war years, 1941 to 1944, there were 38 of these. Each district consisted of several area associations which operated relatively independently and their local branches. Lotta operations covered a wide range of activities, each dealt with by a distinct section. This system varied over time, but at the front during the war it included medical and paramedical, meals and canteens, equipment, office administration, air raid patrol, and signals. Training courses of varying length were provided at various levels for the Lottas in response to the recognized needs. For girls under the age of 18, the Junior Lottas were founded to instill the ideal of love for one's country from an early age. By 1940, there were over 5,000 Junior Lottas. The sense of cohesion was reinforced by the use of a strictly regulated uniform and other equipment. Badges on the uniform indicated the girls' local association and section and their level of training. There were strict regulations about the uniform. The hem of the skirt was supposed to be 20 centimeters off the ground and sometimes might be checked using a tape measure. Similarly, there were strict rules about behavior, including saluting other members. These rules were based on the Lotta Svärd golden words and the Lotta oath which members swore when joining. In this way, Finland acquired an unarmed but highly motivated, well-trained and disciplined women's army corps. In addition to this organized activity, thousands of Finnish women had in fact also prepared for the war without realizing it, through the skills and knowledge which they had acquired in their professions and jobs and studies. The Second World War broke out in Europe in September 1939, following the German occupation of Poland. In response, the Soviet Union, anxious to reinforce its position in Eastern Europe, occupied Eastern Poland and later the Baltic states and demanded negotiations with the government of Finland about territorial concessions. Even as the Finnish delegation was on its way to Moscow, the Finnish armed forces, at Field Marshal Mannerheim's request, began to call up reserves for military exercises.
During these military exercises, many Lottas also worked in the canteens. Following the breakdown of diplomatic negotiations, on November 29, 1939, the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations with Finland, and the next day the Winter War began.
Venäläisten ilmahyökkäys Helsinkiin noin kello 15 aikaan on saanut aikaan hirvittävää.
The Russian air raid on Helsinki has caused appalling damage here. The farmer's dairy office building was hit by a firebomb, and the yard is now full of wrecked cars. One is still on fire. The whole yard is in utter chaos. The emergency services are just arriving now.
Yksi on vielä tulessa siellä ja koko talo.
During the Second World War, Finland was involved in 3 distinct phases of armed conflict. The first was the Winter War, 1939 to 1940, defending the country against an attack by the Soviet Union. After an intervening armistice, this conflict was resumed in the Continuation War, 1941 to 1944. And finally, under the terms of a second armistice, came the Lapland War in 1944, when German troops were expelled from the country. Once war had broken out, the women were right alongside the combatant troops, working in the Red Cross hospitals and in recreation centers for the soldiers and in other duties, depending on their individual training. Under the 1939 Conscripted Labor Act, they were then joined by other women whose family circumstances and skills made them particularly suited for service at the front. During the hostilities between 1939 and 1945, altogether over 200,000 people were wounded or fell ill. Most of them were cared for by nurses, deaconesses, or by the Lotta paramedics. During the winter war fighting, the field hospitals took in a steady stream of the wounded. It was difficult to work because of the bombing, and as the front moved, a field hospital might need to relocate overnight. Paramedical personnel also carried out other duties.
Näin joutui Suomi tahtomattaan sotaan, vaikka
Finland has been forced against her will into war, although a peaceful solution would have been our preference. Now, however, the whole world can see that this is not merely a question of the defenses of Leningrad, for this attack has been launched across the border all the way from Petsamo in the north to Hanko Peninsula in the south. We can be confident that our troops, on land, at sea, and in the air, under the experience and respected command of the Chief of Staff, will fulfill their heroic duty. And I also want to express my deepest and respectful gratitude to our incomparable womenfolk, who with admirable courage and sacrifice, whether alongside our troops or at home, are each, in her own way, also playing their part in our defense and the equipping of our troops.
Joukkojen varustamiseen lausun kunnioittavan kiitokseni.
Once we got clean clothes on the boys, once they'd been bandaged and they got a clean shirt, then it was easier to transport them. The patients were always transferred as soon as they were in condition, at all in condition to travel.
The Finnish army wasn't well equipped when the Winter War broke out. Mending and washing the clothes was the job of the Lottas. The women who served during the Winter War consisted of those Lottas who had signed an agreement to be available for service if needed, and the unmarried or trained women who were recruited by the local associations and branches. This was in accord with a plan drawn up by the Civil Guard, to free up as many men as possible for armed service.
During the Winter War, all these ancillary tasks had to be carried out in very primitive conditions. The laundry usually had to be rinsed in a hole in the ice, and many women ended up with rheumatic disorders, which have never been officially recognized as war injuries. The Winter War came to an end on March 13, 1940.
Sopimus astuu voimaan heti ja ratifioidaan se myöhemmin.
The ceasefire takes immediate effect and will be ratified later. The memorandum attached to the ceasefire agreement specifies the ending of hostilities by both sides to the conflict today, the 13th of March, at 11 o'clock a.m. Finnish time. The memorandum also specifies the dates by which troops are to be withdrawn and territorial transfers are to be carried out.
Ja alueen luovutusten toimeenpaneminen suoritetaan.
So then the order came through very soon about moving back, and then we were transferred to Joensuu, and then they set up a sort of hospital in the high school there. And that was sort of the main hospital for all the troops, and that's where we were all through the armistice period till the war broke out again.
Once the armistice had been declared, there followed a period of repair and reconstruction, but under the constant shadow of a possible resumption of hostilities. The medical operations of the armed forces were reorganized. The Finnish Red Cross carried out an inventory of all the nursing personnel throughout the country, and the military districts were given lists of the 6,850 nurses who could be drafted if needed to work in field hospitals, hospital trains, laboratories, and the blood transfusion service.
For many women, the armistice period meant training and volunteer work, some of it on the fortifications which the Civil Guard was constructing along the eastern border. When hostilities broke out again on June 25, 1941, the Continuation War, public opinion in Finland strongly supported regaining the territories which had been ceded at the end of the Winter War. Risto Ryti, who had been serving as Prime Minister, had just taken over as President of the Republic in an unusually unanimous election.
Kansalaiset, rauhaa rakastava kansamme, joka toista
Citizens,
vuotta on jännittänyt
the peace-loving
kaikki
people of this
voimat
land who for over a year now have been stretched to the utmost to reconstruct the country in the aftermath of the last war, have once again been subjected to a cruel attack.
At the outbreak of the Continuation War, the Finnish Red Cross put over 5,500 nurses at the disposal of the military command. The women posted to these field medical units were either fully qualified nurses, aged between 23 and 35, or unmarried women students in their third year of nursing training. The Red Cross also provided 16 fully equipped field hospitals, 120 ambulances, and a large supply of hospital tents and other medical supplies. In each field hospital, there were usually between 7 and 12 physicians, one or two of whom would be dentists, often women. There would also be between 16 and 19 nurses, and the other personnel would include women from the Lotta brigades and soldiers. The staff selected for field hospital work were picked out as being professionally qualified and resilient, many of them with previous experience from the Winter War. The field hospitals were typically set up in schools or similar buildings, or sometimes in tents.
Siinä muun muassa minä olen sanonut kaikille, että mä oon tehnyt pisimmän päivätyön.
And that's where, and I've told everyone, I did the longest working day of my life. It was a hot summer, and the operating room had been set up in the school kitchens, and I was putting the patients to sleep, and there was this other nurse that was sorting out and cleaning the instruments and trying to sort things out. And when we'd been there for 48 hours breathing that ether, then I don't suppose I'd have got out alive, but the consulting surgeon, Dr. Erkki Peltonen, came along, and he asked us, "How long have you been working here?" And I didn't hear him. So then he noticed, and he said, "Listen, girls, you've been on the go too long," and he ordered us to go and get some sleep, and some others took over.
Altogether, there were 50 military hospitals, 29 field hospitals, 3 military wards and civilian hospitals, and 10 hospital trains. During the Continuation War, the various phases of hostilities, the offensive, the stable phase, and the withdrawal, each brought its own distinct challenges in medical care. For example, when the front stabilized, field hospitals were merged with local military hospitals. The need for nursing personnel varied drastically. During the war, there were 186 nurses working on the hospital trains, which formed a vital link between the field hospitals and the permanent hospitals. More than 237,000 wounded persons were transported on these trains, where it was even possible to carry out difficult and demanding operations. There was a constant shortage of medical labor both in the field hospitals and in the permanent units. The medical lotas were in heavy demand, and Girl Scouts who had done first aid were trained by the Red Cross as nursing aides. The Civil Guard had already been preparing for the worst before the Winter War started in 1939, and over the total period of hostilities, the Lotta Svärd organization equipped 8 field hospitals, complete with trained personnel. Women also served at first aid stations on the battlefield. One kind of work which was extremely wearing emotionally was that of the Lotas who prepared the bodies of the fallen for burial at morgues. Understanding military orders, the fallen were to be buried, where possible, in a communal hero's grave in their hometown.
Our work is grim and merciless, yet serious and profound. We have learned to live with seriousness. It has been our privilege to serve our country and its war heroes.
Some of these women had to perform these duties even for those close to them, their husbands, fiancés, or brothers.
On
During the fall of 1941, the Finnish army advanced beyond the border of 1939. Immediately behind the assault troops came special units of women whose job was to clean up the villages which had been taken and purge them of parasites. The mines laid by the enemy before retreating made this work at times very dangerous. This led to a stable period during the summer of 1944, when a military administration was set up to govern the conquered territory in Karelia, and commercial activities rapidly began to develop to meet the needs of the entire population. This phase saw many women coming to work in Karelia. The biggest of the Lota divisions was catering, which operated almost 400 army canteens. Food was often in short supply and of poor quality, and it must have been difficult for the Lotas, doing the best they could in the circumstances, to listen to the complaints from the starving and exhausted soldiers. Sometimes they had to work a 24-hour shift. The Lotas set up bigger canteens further back behind the lines, and brought in coffee, or later ersatz coffee, buns and other things as close to the combat zone as they could, so they were often also at risk from enemy fire. These women came to be known as the front-line Lotas.
There were also recreation centers, run by the Green Sisters, which provided the soldiers with books, newspapers, radios, gramophones, musical instruments, and games. You could buy coffee, or later ersatz, and buns and coffee cakes, cigarettes, postcards, and stationery. But the most important thing of all were the Green Sisters themselves, with their friendly smiles.
By spring of 1944, there were 600 of these recreation centers in operation, with around 1,800 Green Sisters working in them. As the fighting dragged on, these centers played a crucial role for the troops. When necessary, the centers could be moved at night on military trucks and buses to their new locations. There was also a separate association that provided recreation centers along the coast, and 7 of the hospital trains also had recreation centers on board. As the continuation war dragged on, the amount of work that faced the women continually increased. For instance, in the laundries and mobile laundries operating behind the front, Lotas and conscripted women washed something like 70 tons of dirty laundry every month. The Central Committee of the Lota Sverd organization continued to manage the almost overwhelming logistics of all these operations throughout the hostilities. But all the correspondence and negotiations relating to this took place at such a high level that the ordinary Lotas at the front and the public at large knew little about it, neither at the time nor for several decades after the war was over. Within occupied Karelia, where many of the population spoke Finnish dialects, schools began to operate in Finnish, and many of these were run by women teachers. It also soon became clear that the need for office and clerical staff was much greater than had been initially estimated. These women worked in offices at military headquarters, in hospitals, quartermaster stores, and in the morgues. A Lota who could type was worth her weight in gold. One of their tasks was to sort and to censor the soldiers' mail. As the war continued, the soldiers who were doing these tasks were really needed for combat duty, so regular college courses were suspended for women aged over 18, who were sent instead to train for these duties.
During the armistice period, as preparations for a possible renewing of fighting were underway, more and more Lotas were trained to use technical equipment. Telephone operators became signals Lotas. In fact, almost all the telephone exchanges, from small units at the front to the major focal units, were run by women. Women were also trained as Morse and telegraph and telex operators, and as coast guards. Other Lotas worked as meteorologists and cartographers, and most of the air raid warning and communication system was also run by women from the Lota brigades.
These were among the most dangerous tasks which the Lotas undertook. There were 650 air raid warning stations in all, some of them immediately next to the front. In their unprotected towers in the cold of the Winter War, and unarmed, these women kept watch for enemy aircraft, for infiltrators, and for forest fires. Some of these stations were even manned by junior Lottas. It was largely due to the vigilance and speed of communications of these air raid warning stations that Finland's tiny fleet of fighter aircraft were able to respond effectively to enemy bombing raids. In spring 1944, for the first time, the principle that women should not bear arms was breached when the Army trained a company of 145 high school graduate women as a fully combat-ready searchlight battery whose military training included firearms practice. During the Second World War, horses still played a major role in the fighting on the Finnish front, and these horses, like the human combatants, faced heavy physical and emotional strain. Veterinary Lottas, typically farm girls, were trained to assist the military veterinaries. They would assist in the operating room and look after medical instruments and change dressings on wounds. Following the breakdown of peace negotiations on June 9, 1944, the Soviet Union launched a major attack on the Karelian Isthmus. The Finns were forced back, and on June 20th, following the loss of Viipuri, the Finnish government contacted the Soviet authorities to sound out conditions for an end to the hostilities. The Soviets demanded Finland's unconditional surrender. 50 years later, the opening of the Soviet Foreign Ministry archives has revealed what a surrender at this point would have meant for Finland. Its total isolation from the West, the disarming of the armed forces, and the arrest and probable internment of all who had been members of the Civil Guard, including the Lottasvärd. In other words, the destiny of hundreds of thousands of Finns. Finland chose not to surrender. Instead, reinforced by rearmaments and food supplies from Germany, the exhausted army succeeded in putting up incredible resistance, forcing the Soviet troops in turn to withdraw, leading to the signing of an armistice which, although it imposed heavy burdens on the country, nonetheless allowed Finland to retain her sovereignty. The initial Soviet attack, the retreat, and the bitter fighting in the resistance phase all strained the medical personnel to the utmost. The numbers of wounded and dead were very high, and the stress of constant relocation and unrelenting pressure from the enemy were almost intolerable.
The evacuation of the civilian population from the territory that was lost was a major operation, involving around 3,500 Lottas. Canteen catering was also maintained throughout the withdrawal, though on a reduced scale. The ceasefire took effect on September 4th, 1944.
The signing of this armistice means that we must immediately begin withdrawing our troops. Behind the line agreed in the peace treaty of 1940. Karelia, therefore, is lost. Armistice Agreement, paragraph 21. Finland undertakes immediately to dissolve all pro-Hitler organizations of a fascist type situated on Finnish territory, whether political, military, or paramilitary, as well as other organizations conducting propaganda hostile to the United Nations, in particular to the Soviet Union, and will not in future permit the existence of organizations of that nature.
The Control Commission established by the Soviet Union and the Western Allies to oversee the implementation of the peace treaty considered that this article meant that the Civil Guard should be abolished. And in this political situation, the Lottasvärd organization was also disbanded. A time of silence about the Lottas began.
On November 6, 1944, General Lauri Malmberg, Commander-in-Chief of the Civil Guard, spoke on the radio to the members of the disbanded Civil Guard and the Lottasvärd, thanking the Lottas for their crucial support over 25 years, which had helped to make possible the extended and effective defense of the nation. And he called on them to confront with courage the difficult post-war times ahead.
Yleensä rintamaveteraanien mainekkaan ei ollut kovin kehuttava silloin sodan jälkeisinä vuosina.
People weren't very positive about the veterans from the front in those post-war years. We've all heard the comments like, "So why did you have to go and bang your head against the trees in Karelia?" and so on. But as for the Lottas and the other women that had been there were all kinds of weird ideas going around. They thought we had been some kind of fun girls, when actually we'd been there as volunteers, and we were under really strict discipline. So what that led to was that people stopped talking about it.
Ja siitä oli semmoinen seuraus, että suut sulkeutuivat. Kyllähän asia niin oli, että eihän siitä sota-ajasta puhuttu, mutta koska olin sairaanhoitajana toiminut kenttäsairaalassa Kannaksella 44.
Yes, that's true. We didn't really talk about the war anymore. But since I'd been working there as a nurse in the field hospitals on the Karelian Isthmus in summer 44, and then in the fall I was demobilized and went back to my own job, then actually I went on treating the wounded right through to 49. So for me anyway, the war still carried on. Later I was doing completely different kind of work, not as a nurse anymore, but anyway, none of us back then talked at all about what it had been like.
Kertonut omista kokemuksistaan.
Et onko se tämä lottana oleminen, joka vielä niin kuin jää sinne semmoiseksi kaiken?
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's that having been one of the Lottas sort of sticks with you and preys on your mind. Or is it just that being a woman, is it in your nature? That you don't want to dwell on things like that?
Niin se aivan hämmästyksen lyömänä sanoi, että et sinä ole koskaan puhunut, että sinä olet ollut sodassa. Minä sanoin, että en ole puhunut.
So then he was taken completely by surprise and said, "You'd never said anything about being in the war." So I said, "No, I haven't. We simply kept quiet about it. We didn't talk, and maybe that was a mistake." So there's a whole generation in between that don't know about the women at the front at all.
Sitäkään vähän, mitä rintamamiehistä tiedettiin.
Finland had preserved her independence, but post-war reconstruction and the reparations that were paid to the Soviet Union created an enormous burden of work. The generation of women that had been in the war got married, had children, built themselves houses, and cared for their invalids, while public discussion about the war went its own way. Many of those who'd been at the front had to listen to their actions being questioned, but simply held their tongues. It wasn't until 1970 that war veterans were first acknowledged by the state, when the men's military passes were stamped recognizing their war service. The debates that surrounded the passing of this legislation were followed closely by a former Lotta, Mirja Hakko, a journalist on the newspaper Kaleva, published in Oulu.
Oulun sotilaspiiriin oli marssinut myöskin naisia.
It seems that some women had come marching into the Oulu military headquarters. Some of them were crying, and they were turned away. They were told, "This doesn't apply to women, it only applies to men, and it's a stamp in their military pass." So it must have been then that I turned to my typewriter. We didn't have computers in those days, and I wrote that article. Our editor back then was a guy called Esko Saarinen. He'd been at the front himself, and he was from the Helsingin Sanomat newspaper. The way it was back then, there hadn't been much discussion about these things. And he read it and he said, "That's fine. That's just the way he knew things were, and that's how it started." And then when it was published, it was early in April, real soon after the first of those military passes had been stamped. Then my phone started to ring there in the office. And there were men calling in too, surprisingly enough, and they were backing me up. And they said, "It's wrong you haven't been included at all." And that year we had parliamentary elections. That was 1970. And there was this young candidate that got elected from Oulu. Oh, we were all so young then, only in our 50s. Kerttu Hemmi, a nurse. And she was one of the people that called that day when the article had been in the paper. And then when we talked for a bit, she said right then and there on the phone, "Look, we should set up an association." I have to confess I wasn't terribly enthusiastic that first day, because I was so tied up with all my work. But then after the idea had simmered across the summer, and then in the fall, Kerttu Hemmi called this meeting together to set up the association. And it took us all by surprise. Kerttu had managed to book the Oulu City Hall Council chamber for us, and it was really full. There were about 100 women.
Ja se tuli niin tupaten täyteen, sinne tuli noin 100 naista.
Ja kyllä täytyy ihmetellä ja ihailla Oulun seudun rintamanaisia, että heillä oli sen ajan.
And I have to say, I'm really impressed by the women veterans up there in Oulu. That in the atmosphere there was back then, that they had the courage to get going and push for the rights of the women who'd been at the front. It wasn't straightforward or anything back in those days.
Asia kyllä silloin, siihen aikaan.
Se rintamanainen oli meille ihan itsestään selvä asia, koska oli silloin jo rintamamiesten yhdistys toiminut puolikymmentä vuotta.
So calling it the Women Veterans, that was clear from the start, because the men, they'd had their own Veterans Association around for 5 years then, and there was this delegation from the men's area committee that came to that first meeting, and they really backed us up to get started. So it was clear then that we were the Women Veterans, and the first name was then the Northern Ostrobothnia Women Veterans, and it just kept growing. So that when we'd been going for about a year, we had 1,000 members. And one of the first things, of course, was how do we get in touch with all those other women veterans scattered around the country? So then I wrote this article, just a short one, and I said, were you out there? Because that out there, that was the acceptable term back then. And so we began to get more members coming in, and soon we were getting overwhelmed by how many there were, because we didn't have any hired office staff. Kerttu Hemmi had said right from the beginning that we ought to have a national association, but we didn't really have the courage. But it was Kerttu's doing that we got this National Federation for Women Veterans, and that was in 1980.
Sen aikaan, että syntyi tämä rintamanaisten liitto vuonna 1980.
Niin mehän menimme tai pääsimme eduskuntaan samoissa vaaleissa vuonna 1970.
So then we went and got elected to Parliament in the same election in 1970, along with Kerttu Hemmi, who was mentioned by Mirja Hakko earlier. And this Kerttu Hemmi was untiring. Of course, she had the support of all of us women veterans who had been in Parliament. Anyway, she worked incredibly hard to get things moving, and it was in 74, I think, that there was this supplementary war pension, which women got as well. And then the next step, which had gradually gathered support from lots of other quarters as well, was this front service certificate, which was awarded to women. And then the following year, Kerttu Hemmi launched the initiative to set up the Veterans Board. But then around that time, Kerttu Hemmi got sick, and in the elections in 79, she had to step down from Parliament. But we carried on and pushed this proposal through as a joint effort. And so from that, we were able to achieve a lot for the veterans, both the men and the women, through this Veterans Board.
The Advisory Board on Veterans Affairs was set up in conjunction with the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. From the outset, it included officials from various different ministries, from the Veterans Associations and the War Invalids Association, representatives from each of the main political parties, and Kerttu Hemmi herself as the individual who had launched the whole idea. Not everyone approved of Kerttu being a member of the board, however.
Siitä tehtiin hallitukselle kysely.
So then there was this question put to the government as to why was this other very small party represented on the Veterans Board when they weren't? And the minister pointed out that it was Kerttu Hemmi who'd been appointed, who'd been the one who launched the original initiative in the first place, and that sort of led to this board being necessary. And by then there were associations already functioning. There was the one in Oulu, and then there was the one for Helsinki and Uusimaa province, and the Porvoo district came a bit later, and then there was the Savo province association in Pieksämäki, and another in northern Karelia. And before it got going, there'd been this council with the presidents of those 5 associations. They'd have meetings, and they were writing the statutes, and there was quite a bit of opposition with people saying that the women shouldn't be setting up on their own, but they should be working in the men's associations. The biggest and grandest of them all, the Finnish War Veterans Association, was quite snooty to us. And then later its president says in this article by Mirja Hakko that it hadn't been possible to do so much for the women because the women hadn't been active enough. So then on the 21st of September 1980, representatives from each of the associations that were functioning at that time gathered together at the Helsinki Hotel there on Kluvikatu Street. And that's where this National Federation was established.
Siellä tämä liitto perustettiin. Sitten hän vuonna 1983 meille tuli.
And then in 1983 we got our current president, or executive director, Laine-Maire Kyöstilä. And that's when we started to expand and to set up new associations, so that now we've got 32 associations.
The members of these associations consisted of women who served at the front. The majority of them were Lottasvärd members. The others included nurses, nursing aides, green sisters, physicians, and women who were doing conscripted labor. In 2008, their average age is 86. The Federation of Women Veterans in Finland operates on a veteran spirit of mutual support, and it has a clear underlying vision.
And of course what we hope is that we will never need women at the front again in this country nor anywhere else in the world.
The women veterans organizations set out to pass on this message to the younger generations by telling them what a difficult task the wartime generations had to face.
Ja tätä työtähän aloitettiin aivan heti teillä siellä pohjoisessa.
And it was you who embarked on this work up there in the north and in Helsinki and Uusimaa. And then as new associations were set up and the information spread, then they collected these women's war memoirs.
Jollei, niin voitaneen hyväksyä.
The ultimate authority in the Federation of Women Veterans in Finland is the annual meeting each year. Between annual meetings, business is handled by the Executive Board, which meets 6 times a year, assisted by a working committee which meets 4 or 5 times each year, or more often if needed. The National Federation has its offices in Helsinki. Until 1999, the staff were all volunteers, working without salary. But when the average age of staff reached 80 and over, salaried part-time office help was needed. The membership dues for the women veterans organizations are very modest. The cornerstone of the funds is the Red Feather Collection, which was organized by the Lions back in 1986 when they raised 1 million Finnmarks. The Federation has also granted some financial assistance from the National Lottery and Gambling Agency, and donations from the Commemoration Fund for the Fallen, and some other funds and companies give donations as well. The money goes toward funding the activities of the affiliated associations, with the largest budget item being paying for leisure and rehabilitation activities and personal assistance for members. The Women Veterans Federation collaborates closely with other veterans organizations. The presidents and executive directors meet regularly together, and they run a wide range of joint projects and issue joint statements. On the international level, the Federation is linked with the World Veterans Federation and its Standing Committee on Women.
We're unique. We were the first women's organization to be accepted there as a member. So we've set an example for the whole field of veterans work, showing that women have to stand up and defend their interests themselves.
Maailman veteraanijärjestö on perustettu 1950. Aloite siis oli voittajavaltioiden.
The World Veterans Federation was first set up in 1950 as a joint organization among the Western Allies. In 1953, when the first Finnish organization joined, the Disabled War Veterans Association, the German associations for war invalids and for the families of the fallen were also admitted to membership. So it became an umbrella organization including both sides, the victors and the defeated, former enemies. Gradually, the other Finnish veterans associations were also admitted. And in 1984, the Women's Veterans Federation was taken in, the first women's organization to be admitted to membership. The goals of the World Organization are to bring nations closer together, to promote disarmament, and to help establish the conditions for lasting peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter. Sometimes it breaks your heart to remember that wars are still being waged all the time. And who are the victims? It's the women, of course. The International Red Cross has estimated that over 90% of the victims of modern warfare are women and children. Back in 1991, Lea Suutinen, who was our president at the time, said in a speech, "Skin color may vary, but the color of the mother's tears is always the same."
Ihonväri vaihtelee, äitien kyyneleet ovat samanlaiset.
That it has been an enormous pleasure and something for which I am very grateful to have had the privilege of working with the Federation and the women who have participated. Without exaggerating, I would say that this organization has made the work of the Standing Committee on Women possible because you have been the longest supporter of the committee. And I want to pay special tribute to Lina Myra. And with her help, we have brought the Committee on Women, I would say, without too much.
For many years, the biggest event each year was the Summer Fair, which the regional associations arranged in turn. The last Summer Fair, run by the organization itself, was held in 2006.
Fellow veterans, ladies and gentlemen, on this auspicious occasion, I bring greetings from 160 member associations of the World Veterans Federation, representing some 30 million veterans worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, the fundamental aim of the Federation of Women Veterans in Finland is similar to that of the World Veterans Federation, which is to promote the well-being of veterans.
In 2008, the younger generations came to help. The Women's National Emergency Preparedness Association organized in Jyväskylä a traditional summer fair for women veterans. And this was received with much gratitude.
Tässä vähän tätä jatkoa ajatella.
And then I'd like to mention how in '93 we managed to set up this Women's Veterans Foundation with the task of cherishing this tradition as we disappear, and of laying up our flag in the same place with the other veterans organizations' flags.
In 1918, Mannerheim defined military combat as a duty restricted to men. 77 years later, women in Finland obtained the right to carry out the same military service as men, and in the fall of 1991, the first women began to train for the United Nations peacekeeping duties. The first woman officer trainee entered the military academy in fall 1996, and in January 1997, the first women started training as non-commissioned officers. In today's changed conditions, Finnish women thus demonstrate the same devotion and readiness to defend their country as in the past. Nevertheless, the message of those of us who have experienced war to the generations that follow after remains unchanged. Never war again.
Me marssimme samaan tahtiin, kuin veljemme rintamaan. Me kuulimme tuntomme kutsun, kun vaarassa on syntymämaa. Me hoidimme, kuivasimme, käsin vahvoin työtämme teimme. Estä rakkaan syntymämaan, estä rakkaan syntymämaan. Ristilippujen hulmutessa palat kalleimmat vannoimme. Läpi kaistojen kenttäin kuljimme, vannoimmatkin uhrimme annoimme. Unohdukset ja pilkatkin kestimme, toinen toistamme lämmöllä tuimme. Oli rakkain isämme maa, oli rakkain isämme maa. Sulta kansojen johtaja korkein, me kuitenkin pyydämme taas. Anna maailman kansoille rauhaa, anna lastemme lapsille.